The Unseen Enemy. Chapter 1. The Briefing. Agent Thomas Gray sat in the dimly lit conference room, his fingers tapping lightly on the polished oak table. The room was cold, almost sterile, with only the faint hum of the ventilation system breaking the silence. Across from him sat Director Alan Weaver, a stern man in his early 60s with a reputation for getting things done. Today, however, his face was etched with worry. "Gray, we have a situation," Weaver began, sliding a thick dossier across the table. "Our mission in Eastern Europe is compromised. We believe there's a mole in our ranks." Gray's heart skipped a beat. A mole? The very thought sent a chill down his spine. He had been in the intelligence game long enough to know that moles were the deadliest kind of enemy, unseen, unknown, and unpredictable. "How certain are we?" Gray asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "Certain enough," Weaver replied, his gaze piercing. "The last 3 operations have all failed spectacularly. We've lost agents, intel, and resources. Someone is feeding information to the enemy, and we need to find out who before they bring the entire mission crashing down." Gray opened the dossier, scanning the contents quickly. Names, dates, mission details, all meticulously documented. The pattern was clear. Every failure had been a direct result of leaked information. The mole was playing a dangerous game, one that threatened not only the mission but the lives of countless agents. "Do we have any leads?" Gray asked, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Not yet," Weaver admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But we've narrowed it down to a handful of suspects. You'll find their profiles in the dossier. Your job is to identify the mole and eliminate the threat, quietly." Gray nodded, understanding the gravity of the task. "And what about the mission? What's the current status?" "We're on hold for now," Weaver said. "Until we can guarantee the integrity of our operations, we're keeping everything under wraps. The last thing we need is another failure." Gray felt the weight of the assignment settle on his shoulders. It was a race against time. Find the mole, secure the mission, and do it all without alerting the enemy. One wrong move and everything could come crashing down. "Understood," Gray said, closing the dossier and rising from his seat. "I'll start immediately." "One more thing," Weaver said as Gray turned to leave. "Trust no one, Gray. The enemy is closer than you think." With those ominous words echoing in his mind, Gray left the room, the dossier tucked securely under his arm. He knew this mission would test him in ways he had never been tested before. The enemy was invisible, hiding in the shadows, and he was about to walk right into the lion's den. But Gray was no stranger to danger. He had faced impossible odds before and come out on top. This time, however, felt different. The stakes were higher, the enemy smarter, and the margin for error razor-thin. As he walked down the narrow hallway, Gray's mind was already working, piecing together the puzzle. He would need to be meticulous, vigilant, and above all, ruthless. The mole could be anyone, an old friend, a trusted colleague, or even a superior. One thing was certain: the hunt had begun and failure was not an option. Chapter 2. The Suspects. Gray spent the next few hours holed up in his small, windowless office, studying the profiles of the suspects. Each one was a seasoned agent with years of experience, making it all the more difficult to pinpoint the traitor. There was Agent Sarah Mitchell, a sharp-minded analyst with a reputation for being cool under pressure. Her calm demeanor and sharp intuition had saved the agency on more than one occasion. But was it all a facade? Could she be the one leaking information? Next was Agent David Harris, a field operative with a knack for blending in. He had spent years undercover, gathering intel from some of the most dangerous places in the world. But his recent missions had all ended in failure. Was it bad luck or something more sinister? Then there was Agent Lisa Chin, the tech wizard of the group. If anyone could manipulate data and cover their tracks, it was her. She had the skills to make anything disappear, including evidence of her own betrayal. And finally, there was Agent Paul Stevens, a seasoned veteran with a no-nonsense attitude. He had seen it all, done it all, and had the scars to prove it. But his recent behavior had been erratic, raising more than a few eyebrows. Gray frowned as he studied the profiles, each one offering a plausible scenario for betrayal. He knew he had to tread carefully. One wrong accusation could tip off the mole, and then they would disappear, leaving him with nothing. As he reviewed the files, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He quickly closed the dossier and called out, "Come in." The door creaked open and Sarah Mitchell stepped into the room, her expression unreadable. "Gray, we need to talk," she said, her voice low. Gray gestured for her to sit, wondering what she could possibly have to say. Was this a genuine conversation, or was she here to manipulate him? He couldn't afford to trust anyone, but he couldn't afford to be paranoid either. "What is it?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the room as if checking for hidden cameras. "I think someone is trying to frame me," she finally said, her eyes locking onto his. Gray's interest peaked. "Go on." "I've noticed a few discrepancies in the mission reports, details that don't add up. It looks like someone's been tampering with the data to make it seem like I'm the one leaking information. But I swear to you, Gray, I'm not the mole." Gray studied her closely, looking for any signs of deception. But Sarah's expression remained earnest, her voice steady. Was she telling the truth, or was this an elaborate ruse to throw him off the scent? "Do you have any proof?" Gray asked, knowing that without evidence, her claims were nothing more than speculation. "Not yet," Sarah admitted, frustration creeping into her voice. "But I'm working on it. I just need more time." Time. Something Gray didn't have much of. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed brought the mission closer to disaster. "All right," Gray said finally. "But if you're right, that means someone is trying to cover their tracks by pointing the finger at you. And that someone is likely our mole." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "That's what I'm afraid of." Gray leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The situation was growing more complicated by the minute. If Sarah was being set up, then the real mole was more cunning than he had anticipated. And if she wasn't, well, that was a risk he couldn't afford to take lightly. "I'll look into it," Gray said, his voice firm. "But in the meantime, keep your head down and your eyes open. Trust no one." Sarah stood up, her face a mask of determination. "I won't let them win, Gray. I promise you that." As she left the room, Gray felt a knot of tension settle in his chest. The game was growing more dangerous by the minute, and the enemy was still hidden in the shadows, waiting to strike. And Gray knew that in a game like this, there could only be one winner. Chapter 3. The Shadow in the Dark. The night was heavy with rain as Gray made his way through the dimly lit streets of the city. His mind was still reeling from the conversation with Sarah, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had a lead to follow, and every second counted. Weaver had given him access to all the agency's surveillance footage from the last 6 months, a goldmine of information if used correctly. Gray knew that the mole's activities would be hidden among the hours of mundane footage, but he was determined to find the needle in the haystack. The safe house was located in a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city, a perfect place to work unnoticed. Gray slipped inside, bypassing the security system with ease. The agency's top-of-the-line equipment hummed quietly as he set to work, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Hours passed as he sifted through the footage, his eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. He watched agents come and go, meetings held in secure rooms, and routine operations being carried out. But nothing stood out. Nothing screamed mole. Frustration gnawed at him, but Gray knew better than to rush. The mole was careful, methodical. They wouldn't make a mistake easily. But Gray was equally methodical, and he had patience. It was in the early hours of the morning, when fatigue was starting to set in, that Gray finally saw something. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there it was. A figure, cloaked in shadows, moving through the corridors of the agency late at night. The figure wore a hoodie, obscuring their face from the cameras, but the way they moved was deliberate, purposeful. Gray zoomed in, enhancing the footage as much as he could. The figure was heading toward the secure archives, a place where only a handful of agents had clearance. The timestamp indicated it was during a night when the agency was supposed to be empty, save for the skeleton security staff. Gray's pulse quickened. This was it. This had to be the mole. But who were they? The footage was too grainy to make out any identifying features, and the figure was careful not to reveal their face. He watched as the figure entered the archives, disappearing from view for several minutes. When they emerged, they were carrying a small, unmarked box, something that could easily contain sensitive information. The figure retraced their steps, slipping back into the shadows and leaving the building undetected. Gray's mind raced. He needed to find out what was in that box and who had the clearance to access the archives at that time. He quickly pulled up the agency's personnel records, cross-referencing the time of the footage with the agents who had clearance to be in the building. The list was short, only 4 agents including Sarah, David, Lisa, and Paul. Any one of them could have been the figure in the footage, but without more information, Gray was still grasping at straws. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The situation was spiraling out of control. The mole was getting bolder and Gray was running out of time. He needed to act and fast. But how could he confront the suspects without tipping his hand? He needed a plan, something that would force the mole to reveal themselves without realizing they were being trapped. Gray's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a soft creak from the floorboards outside the safe house. His hand instinctively moved to the gun holstered at his side. He wasn't expecting anyone. He killed the lights and moved silently toward the door, his senses on high alert. The sound came again, closer this time, as if someone was trying to sneak up on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he pressed his back against the wall, his weapon drawn. Whoever was out there was either very brave or very foolish. But Gray knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. The door handle turned slowly and Gray held his breath, ready to strike. The door creaked open just an inch, enough to let in a sliver of light from the hallway. Gray tightened his grip on the gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. But before he could make a move, the door was suddenly kicked open, and a shadowy figure lunged at him, their movements swift and aggressive. Gray barely had time to react as he was tackled to the ground, his gun skidding across the floor. They grappled in the darkness, each one fighting for control. Gray could feel the strength of his attacker, but he wasn't about to let them get the upper hand. With a quick maneuver, he managed to flip his opponent onto their back, pinning them down. "Who sent you?" Gray demanded, his voice a low growl. The figure remained silent, struggling beneath his grip. Gray reached for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light. He looked down, his eyes widening in shock. It was Agent David Harris, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and anger. But before Gray could say anything, David's expression shifted, a smug smile spreading across his lips. "You're too late, Gray," David whispered, his voice dripping with menace. "It's already begun." A cold dread settled in Gray's stomach as he realized that whatever David was talking about, it wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Chapter 4. The Trap. Gray had no time to react as David's words sank in. Whatever it was, it had already started, and Gray knew that meant disaster. He grabbed David by the collar, pulling him closer, but before he could demand answers, David started laughing, a cold, joyless sound that sent shivers down Gray's spine. "You think you're so smart, Gray," David sneered, "but you're just a pawn in a game you can't even begin to understand." Gray tightened his grip, his voice low and menacing. "Then help me understand. What game are you playing, David?" David's laughter stopped abruptly, his expression shifting to one of pure malice. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about you or me. This is about something much bigger. And you're too late to stop it." Gray's mind raced. He needed to extract information, but it was clear David wasn't going to cooperate willingly. He had to think fast. "What did you steal from the archives?" Gray pressed, trying to keep his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What's in the box?" David's eyes glinted with dark amusement. "You really want to know? Fine. It's everything. Every operation, every asset, every piece of intel this agency has ever gathered. And it's all going to the highest bidder." Gray's blood ran cold. The implications of such a leak were catastrophic. If that information fell into the wrong hands, it could compromise national security and cost countless lives. "You're a traitor, David," Gray hissed, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "You're the mole." David's smirk grew wider. "Took you long enough to figure that out. But it doesn't matter now. The wheels are already in motion. You can't stop what's coming." Gray felt a surge of anger and desperation. He needed to stop David before it was too late, but he was unarmed, and David was clearly prepared for this encounter. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Suddenly, David's free hand shot towards his pocket, and before Gray could react, he felt a sharp pain in his side. He looked down to see a syringe, the needle buried in his flesh. David had injected him with something. Gray staggered back, the room spinning as the effects of the drug took hold. His vision blurred, and he could feel his strength draining away. David watched him with cold satisfaction, knowing that victory was within his grasp. "Goodbye, Gray," David whispered, rising to his feet as Gray collapsed to the floor. "By the time you wake up, it'll all be over." David walked out of the room, leaving Gray lying helpless on the cold, hard floor. Darkness closed in around him, and the last thing Gray heard was the sound of David's footsteps fading into the distance. When Gray finally regained consciousness, he had no idea how much time had passed. His body felt heavy, sluggish, as if he were moving through water. He forced himself to sit up, his mind still foggy from the effects of the drug. The room was empty, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. David was gone, along with whatever he had stolen from the archives. Gray knew he had to act fast. David had a head start, but Gray wasn't about to give up. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, but his determination unwavering. He grabbed his gun from where it had fallen and headed out into the night. As he moved through the deserted streets, Gray's mind cleared, and he began to piece together what had happened. David had set him up, lured him into the safe house, and incapacitated him. But why? And then it hit him. David wasn't just after the intel. He was using it as bait, a way to draw out the real target, Gray himself. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was personal. Gray realized that he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. If he didn't confront David, countless lives would be at risk. He had to end this once and for all. The game was on, and Gray knew there was only one way it could end. Chapter 5. The final move. Gray's pulse pounded in his ears as he navigated the narrow alleyways, his breath visible in the cold night air. The city was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. He could feel the weight of his mission bearing down on him, but he pushed the fear aside. There was no room for doubt. He had to find David before it was too late. The last traces of the drug were still wearing off, but Gray's mind was sharp, his senses heightened by adrenaline. He knew David was leading him somewhere, drawing him into a final confrontation. It was a dangerous game, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Gray's thoughts raced as he considered his next move. David had always been a step ahead, but there had to be something he hadn't accounted for. Something Gray could use to his advantage. He needed to think like David, anticipate his next move, and turn the tables. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. Gray pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. He hesitated for a split second before answering. "Gray," he said, his voice steady. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." David's voice came through the line, smooth and taunting. "But you should have stayed down when you had the chance." "Where are you, David?" Gray demanded, his hand tightening around the phone. "This ends now." David chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down Gray's spine. "You're right about one thing, Gray. This does end now. But not the way you think." Before Gray could respond, David continued, "Meet me at the old docks where it all began. Come alone, or I'll make sure every last piece of that intel goes public." The line went dead, leaving Gray staring at his phone in frustration. The old docks, a place steeped in history, where they had once worked together on one of their first missions. David was playing on their past, using it to lure Gray into his trap. But Gray wasn't the same man he had been back then. He had learned, adapted, and he wasn't going to let David win. Not this time. Gray tucked the phone back into his pocket and headed toward the docks, his mind already formulating a plan. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the agency. This was his fight, and he would see it through to the end. As he approached the docks, Gray could see the dilapidated warehouses looming in the distance, their silhouettes stark against the dark sky. The place was deserted, abandoned years ago when the shipping routes had changed. It was the perfect spot for a final showdown. Gray moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. He had to assume David had backup, though the man was arrogant enough to think he could handle Gray on his own. Still, Gray wasn't about to take any chances. He reached the entrance to one of the warehouses and paused, listening. The sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, but there was no sign of David. Gray slipped inside, his gun drawn, every sense on high alert. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of a broken bulb. Gray advanced slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. He could feel David's presence, a silent tension in the air that told him his old colleague was close. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Gray caught a glimpse of movement. He spun around, his weapon ready, only to see David standing in the center of the room, a smug smile on his face. "Welcome, Gray," David said, spreading his arms wide as if an invitation. "I knew you'd come." Gray kept his gun trained on David, his eyes narrowing. "It's over, David. You've lost." David's smile widened. Have I? Look around, Gray. You're all alone. No one's coming to save you. I don't need saving, Gray replied coldly. But you do. Hand over the intel and maybe I'll let you walk out of here. David laughed, a harsh mocking sound. Still trying to play the hero, aren't you? Always so righteous, so predictable. But you don't get it, do you? This was never about the intel. It was about you and me. This is personal. Gray's mind raced as he tried to piece together David's plan. The intel was a decoy, a way to manipulate Gray into this confrontation. But why? What was David really after? Before he could ask, David continued, You took everything from me, Gray. My career, my life. You were always Weaver's favorite, always the golden boy. And what did I get? Nothing. Well, not anymore. Gray could see the bitterness in David's eyes, the anger that had festered over the years. But there was something else too, something darker, more dangerous. You did this to yourself, David, Gray said, keeping his voice steady. You made your choices. And now I'm making another, David replied, pulling a small device from his pocket. You see this? It's a remote detonator. The entire dock is rigged to blow. One press of this button and it all goes up in flames. Gray's heart skipped a beat. He could see the madness in David's eyes, the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. But I'm giving you a choice, Gray, David said, his voice softening. You can walk away, let me go, and I'll deactivate the bombs. Or you can try to stop me and we both die here tonight. Gray's mind raced, weighing his options. He knew David was serious. He had seen that look in the eyes of too many desperate men before. But Gray wasn't about to let him get away, not after everything he had done. You know I can't let you walk away, Gray said, his voice cold and determined. David's smile faded, replaced by a look of resigned acceptance. I figured you'd say that. In one swift motion, David pressed the button on the detonator. Gray lunged forward, firing his gun just as the room was engulfed in a blinding flash of light. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The explosion rocked the docks, sending debris flying in all directions. Gray was thrown to the ground, the force of the blast knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, all he could hear was a deafening roar, his vision obscured by smoke and dust. But he was alive. Somehow he had survived. Gray forced himself to his feet, his body aching from the impact. The warehouse was a scene of utter devastation. Walls blown apart, metal beams twisted and broken, and fire spreading rapidly through the wreckage. David's body lay a few feet away, motionless, a twisted figure half buried under the rubble. The detonator was still clutched in his hand, his final act of defiance etched on his lifeless face. Gray staggered toward him, the heat from the flames searing his skin. He kicked the detonator away, knowing that whatever David had planned was over. The intel was lost, but so was the man who had betrayed everything they had once stood for. As the fire raged around him, Gray felt a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was finally over. David was gone and the threat he had posed was extinguished. But it came at a heavy price. Gray could hear the distant wail of sirens as emergency responders rushed to the scene. He knew he had to get out of there before they arrived. He had no intention of explaining what had happened. Some things were better left unsaid. He took one last look at the wreckage before turning away, his thoughts already on the future. The mission had been compromised, the intel lost, but Gray was still standing. He had faced the enemy, and though it had cost him dearly, he had won. But as he walked away from the burning docks, Gray knew this victory was a hollow one. The enemy had been unseen, hidden in the shadows, and it had taken everything he had to defeat it. The world he returned to was no longer the same, and neither was he. But one thing was certain. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Gray would be ready.